Ricky Nelson was born as Eric Hilliard Nelson on May 8, 1940 in Teaneck, New Jersey. Ricky started working in show business almost as soon as he could walk. His parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, were already famous entertainers, and their long-running radio and TV show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, became one of America's most loved family comedy shows. Ricky grew up on camera, sharing the screen with his older brother, David Nelson, and for millions of TV watchers, he was the perfect American boy. Polite, handsome, and naturally cool. But behind this clean-cut image was a young man quietly soaking up the sounds of a music revolution. While America watched him grow up on TV, Ricky was carefully listening to the new sounds of rock and roll. He was deeply influenced by artists like Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Buddy Holly. Unlike many child stars whose careers disappeared as they got older, Nelson made a brave and really successful change from TV actor to serious music artist. In 1957, he recorded his first big hit, I'm Walking, followed by Teenager's Romance. Almost overnight, Ricky Nelson became a music star. His smooth, calm singing style, combined with great musicianship and clean-cut good looks, made him impossible to resist for teenage fans. What made him different, though, was his insistence on working with top-quality musicians and recording real rock and roll rather than silly pop music. He famously hired members of Elvis Presley's band, including guitarist James Burton, whose sharp twangy sound became part of what made Nelson's early record special. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, Ricky Nelson ruled the music charts with an amazing string of hits, including Hello Mary Lou, Poor Little Fool, Traveling Man, Lonesome Town, Believe What You Say, and Garden Party. His records sold millions, and he became one of the first artists to successfully combine TV fame with real musical respect. Importantly, he never relied only on his fame. He practiced constantly, toured regularly, and treated music as a lifelong passion rather than just a temporary thing. As musical tastes changed in the 1960s, Nelson once again showed his ability to adapt. Rather than holding on to his teen idol past, he grew as an artist, embracing country rock and folk rock influences years before they became popular. Albums like Bright Lights and Country Music showed his willingness to take creative chances, even when success wasn't guaranteed. Though these choices sometimes pushed away casual fans, they earned him deep respect among musicians and critics who recognized his honesty. Perhaps no moment in his career better captured the struggle between past expectations and artistic growth than the infamous Madison Square Garden concert in 1971, where Nelson was booed for performing new material instead of his early hits. Rather than backing down, he responded with one of his most lasting songs, Garden Party, a thoughtful and gently defiant anthem about staying true to yourself. The song became a hit and remains a defining statement of his philosophy, evolve or be trapped by nostalgia. By 1974, the once unquestioned magic surrounding the former teen idol had almost completely disappeared, leaving MCA Records uncertain and worried about what to do next. The industry that had once celebrated him as a guaranteed hitmaker now watched as albums like Windfall arrived quietly and disappeared just as quickly, failing to make any real impact on the charts or bring back his earlier glory. The difference was striking. A performer who had once commanded screaming crowds and radio dominance was now struggling to find his place in a rapidly changing music world. As record sales stopped, Nelson's career took an unexpected turn. Rather than headlining concert halls or topping playlists, he became a nostalgic attraction at family-friendly theme parks like Knott's Berry Farm and Disneyland, performing for audiences who remembered him more for what he had been than for what he was becoming. At the same time, he began appearing in small television roles, tiny, often forgettable parts that hinted at his lingering name recognition but offered little in the way of a true comeback. Refusing to give up quietly, Nelson continued to chase the spark that had once come so easily. He returned to the recording studio, hoping that the right song might restart his career, but efforts like Rock and Roll Lady failed to connect with either critics or the public. Each release seemed to highlight the same painful truth. The sound of the moment had moved on, and the industry was no longer willing to wait. Ricky Nelson's romantic life was as complicated and sad as the fame that followed him from childhood into adulthood. As a teenage idol loved by millions, Nelson dated frequently, surrounded by admiration and opportunity. Yet his personal choices were never completely his own. His mother, Harriet Nelson, kept strict control over his private life, disapproving of almost every young woman he grew close to. She believed her son had a carefully built image to protect and insisted that his career come before emotional relationships. In Harriet's eyes, romance was a distraction, and Ricky was expected to live up to an ideal that left little room for youthful freedom or personal happiness. That control seemed to ease in April 1963 when Nelson married Kristen Harmon, a union that seemed almost destined for Hollywood royalty. Kristen was the daughter of football legend Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox, longtime friends of the Nelson family, making the match seem safe, respectable, and approved. To the public, the marriage looked like a perfect blending of talent, fame, and legacy. Together, Ricky and Kristen built a family that would leave a lasting mark on entertainment history. They welcomed 4 children, twin sons Gunnar Eric Nelson and Matthew Gray Nelson, who would later find success as the founders of the band Nelson, actress Tracy Christine Nelson, who carved out her own respected acting career, and their youngest, Sam Hilliard Nelson. For a time, Ricky appeared to have achieved the stability and happiness that had long escaped him. Behind closed doors, however, the marriage was far from the fairy tale fans imagined. As the pressures of fame, personal differences, and emotional distance grew, cracks began to form, growing wider after the birth of their last child. What followed was a long, painful, and emotionally draining decline, marked by conflict and legal battles that exhausted both partners. After years of strain, the marriage officially ended in December 1982, closing a chapter that had once promised so much but delivered deep heartbreak instead. In the years following the divorce, Nelson found companionship with Helen Blair, a relationship that offered him a sense of comfort and normalcy he had rarely known. The two grew close, and 2 years after their first meeting, Blair moved in with him, becoming an important part of his life. Their bond, however, would be tragically cut short. Helen Blair died alongside Ricky Nelson in the devastating airplane fire that claimed his life. In a final haunting twist of fate, she was denied burial beside him. An act enforced by the same maternal authority that had once controlled his youthful romances. Ricky Nelson's love life, from teenage constraints to adult heartbreak, mirrors the deeper tragedy of his existence. A man celebrated by the world, yet often denied the freedom to live, love, and rest on his own terms, even in death. In the final years of his life, as Ricky Nelson looked back on decades spent in the harsh spotlight of fame, he became increasingly reflective and surprisingly open. Known to the world as the forever youthful teen idol with a velvet voice and matinee idol looks, Ricky carried with him a far more complicated inner life than most fans ever imagined. In quiet conversations and rare moments of honesty, he began speaking about the music industry, its illusions, and the fellow artists who were both lifted up and damaged by it. One name in particular stood out when Ricky spoke with unexpected intensity: Roy Orbison. To the public, Roy Orbison was almost mythical. An operatic voice, dark sunglasses, and heartbreaking songs that sounded as if they came from some deep, unreachable place. But Ricky saw something else. Something few people ever noticed. People thought Roy had it all figured out, Ricky once said. They thought he was above the madness. The truth is, he was hurting just like the rest of us. Ricky and Roy traveled in overlapping circles during the golden age of rock and roll. A time when success came fast and consequences came faster. While their public images couldn't have been more different, Ricky, the clean-cut American dream, Roy, the mysterious, almost tragic figure, Ricky believed they were bound by the same invisible chains. "We were products before we were people," Ricky admitted. Roy just hid it better. What shocked Ricky most, and what he felt driven to speak about near the end of his life, was how deeply misunderstood Roy Orbison truly was. Everyone thought Roy was this confident genius who didn't need approval, Ricky said. But he needed it more than anyone. He just didn't know how to ask for it. According to Ricky, Roy carried huge emotional weight, keeping both his success and his failures inside, in silence, convinced that showing vulnerability would somehow weaken the power of his music. Ricky compared this with his own experience as a former child star who grew up in front of cameras. "I was trapped by my image," he said bluntly. But Roy was trapped by expectations. That's a different kind of prison. Ricky believed Roy felt pressure not only to perform, but to embody sorrow, to live up to the pain audiences heard in his songs, even when it cost him personally. As the years passed and musical trends changed, both men struggled with staying relevant in an industry that rarely shows loyalty. Ricky felt that Roy's pain deepened during those periods of commercial uncertainty. When the phone stopped ringing, it cut him deep, Ricky revealed. He took it personally, like it meant he didn't matter anymore. This, Ricky felt, was the great lie of fame, that success equals worth. Perhaps the most startling truth Ricky shared was his belief that Roy Orbison never truly escaped the emotional isolation that fame created. "People loved his voice," Ricky said quietly. "But they didn't always love him, and he knew the difference." That realization haunted Ricky as well, especially as he approached his own later years, wrestling with legacy and identity. In speaking about Roy Orbison, Ricky Nelson wasn't exposing a scandal or tearing down a legend. Instead, he was pulling back the curtain on a shared reality, one where huge talent existed alongside deep loneliness. Roy wasn't weak, Ricky concluded. He was human, and the world doesn't always know what to do with that. In the end, Ricky's reflections feel less like a revelation about Roy Orbison and more like a confession about himself and about an entire generation of artists shaped and scarred by sudden fame. Through his words, Roy Orbison emerges not diminished but deeply human, reminding us that behind even the most iconic voices often lies a silence no one else can hear. What was meant to be a night of celebration turned into one of the most haunting tragedies in music history. In the early hours of December 31st, 1985, on the eve of a new year that fans expected Nelson to help ring in with song and celebration, his life was cut short in a catastrophic plane disaster. Nelson was traveling aboard his own Douglas DC-3 aircraft en route from Guntersville, Alabama to Dallas, Texas, where he was scheduled to headline a New Year's Eve concert. Instead of applause and countdowns, the journey ended in terror, fire, and permanent loss. Mid-flight, the aircraft was suddenly hit by a raging cabin fire, later traced to a broken heater located in the tail section of the plane. Smoke rapidly filled the passenger cabin, turning the interior into a deadly trap. With flames spreading and visibility disappearing, the pilots fought desperately to maintain control long enough to attempt an emergency landing. The plane was forced down into an open field, skidding to a violent stop as fire engulfed the fuselage. In a grim twist of fate, both pilots managed to survive by escaping through the cockpit windows moments before the aircraft was consumed by flames. But for Nelson and the 6 other passengers aboard, escape proved impossible. Trapped inside the smoke-filled cabin, overcome before they could find a way out, all 7 passengers died. The tragedy was made even more painful by later revelations that the aircraft had experienced mechanical problems on previous flights. Warnings that in hindsight showed how preventable the disaster might have been. News of Nelson's death sent shockwaves through the music world and beyond. Fans who had been preparing to celebrate the new year with his performance instead mourned the sudden and horrifying loss of a beloved artist. The crash did not merely end a flight. It marked the devastating conclusion of a life still filled with plans, performances, and promise. December 31st, 1985 would forever be remembered not as a night of music and joy, but as the night when flames in the sky silenced Nelson's voice forever.